They say the dead never sleep easy in the Louisiana heat, especially not on nights when the air tastes like sugar and blood. In the summer of 1849, the magnolias around St. Augustine Parish bloomed thick as ghosts, their scent drifting through the cane fields and the blistered wood of the Rosewater Plantation. On that land, time moved slower than mercy, and both were scarce. Crickets sang over the swamps like a funeral choir, and the moon, swollen and heavy, hung above the plantation house like an unblinking eye. Inside that house, preparations were underway for a wedding, a celebration meant to cleanse the Rosewater name of its many sins. The master, Charles Beauregard, a man of lineage and cruelty, was to marry a young debutante from New Orleans. The household buzzed with nervous energy. Silver polished until it blinded, silk drapes steamed and perfumed, and white candles lined the dining hall like bones awaiting fire. And beneath that grandeur, deep in the belly of the kitchen, Martha worked, hands dusted with flour, wrists scarred by years of servitude. She was the plantation's head cook, or as the mistress once sneered, the slave who knows how to make even suffering taste sweet. No one knew Martha's age. Some said she was born under the same magnolia tree where her mother died giving birth. Others whispered she'd come from the Carolinas, sold and resold until her eyes turned the color of storm water and her silence hardened into armor. But everyone agreed on one thing. Martha never cried, never raised her voice, and never forgot a face. On that night, her oven glowed like a small sun in the dark, and on the table before her lay the makings of the wedding cake, the pride of the Rosewater feast. Layer upon layer of white sugar, lemon zest, and almond paste, a cake so pure, so delicate, that even the master himself had ordered she use only her cleanest hands to craft it. But what no one saw was the tremor in those hands. What no one heard was the faint clinking of something not quite sugar being mixed into the batter. Tiny, sharp, glinting shards that caught the candlelight like tears of glass. Outside, laughter echoed from the parlor, the sound of privilege pretending to be joy. Inside the kitchen, Martha stirred in silence, her face calm, her heartbeat steady, her eyes reflecting the fire's glow. To anyone passing by, she was simply doing her duty. But in that quiet rhythm of motion, sift, fold, stir, a storm was building, patient and unstoppable. For 10 years, Martha had fed the Beauregards, their weddings, their births, their deaths. She'd cooked for their celebrations and cleaned after their violence. Her recipes had traveled farther than her name ever would. But tonight, she was not baking a cake. She was building a weapon. And by dawn, the Rosewater Plantation would never taste sweetness again. Morning in St. Augustine Parish was never kind, not even to those born free. But to the enslaved who lived on the Rosewater Plantation, dawn was less a beginning than a continuation of something that refused to end. The first light crept over the cane fields like a bruise healing in reverse, staining the horizon in shades of iron and ash. Dew clung to the blades of sugar cane, like sweat on the backs of those who would soon harvest them. The air smelled of damp earth, smoke, and salt from the nearby bayou, a mixture that could choke a throat if you breathed too deeply. From the quarters came the rustle of bare feet on dirt, hushed prayers and the faint rattle of tin cups. The sound of chains was gone here. Rosewater had learned that obedience did not always require them, but the silence between each sound carried a weight heavier than iron. A single bell from the main house tower marked the beginning of the day, and every soul on the property rose to meet it. Martha was always first awake, even before the bell, before the roosters, before the sky could decide if it wanted to turn blue. She moved through the dark with a quiet purpose, her breath even, her steps soft. The kitchen was her domain, not out of privilege, but because she had learned to make it so. A place where she could command fire, water, knife, and spice. A place where she could create or destroy as she pleased. Her figure was small, though she carried herself as if the world balanced on her shoulders. Her skin, once deep and unblemished, now bore the pale flecks of burns from years near open flame. Her eyes were gray, not naturally so, but from time, grief, and smoke. Her hair was always bound tight in a faded cloth, one she had dyed herself using ash and blackberry juice, the same color she once said her mother's funeral dress had been. The other servants feared her silence. They said she could make a man's stomach turn with a spoonful of stew if she willed it, that she spoke to the fire and the fire listened, that she sometimes left offerings, bits of bread, drops of molasses, beneath the kitchen floorboards, whispering the names of the dead before dawn. Martha never denied the rumors. She let them swirl around her like smoke, invisible armor in a world that demanded she bow her head. Each morning followed the same rhythm: water drawn from the well, dough kneaded, wood split for the ovens, bacon salted, and coffee boiled for the master. Her hands worked without pause, but her mind never stopped moving. Every sound, every step on the floorboards above her, she catalogued. Every conversation half heard between the mistress and the guests, she stored. Every insult, every strike, every small humiliation that passed beneath the whitewashed ceilings found its echo somewhere in her quiet memory. She had learned long ago that silence was not weakness, it was strategy. Words were dangerous things here. They could be twisted, misheard, or used as reason for punishment. But silence was survival. It allowed her to move unseen even when standing in plain sight. Above the kitchen, the Beauregard house stood proud and rotting all at once. Columns of cracked white plaster framed the front porch, and ivy crawled up the side like veins searching for a heart. The master's ancestors had built it with slave hands, and it showed. The floors uneven, the walls whispering when the wind turned, as if the house itself remembered. Inside, portraits of stern men stared down at everything, and dust settled thick on the velvet curtains that once dazzled visitors from New Orleans. Martha had never been upstairs except to serve, but she knew every inch of that kitchen, every creak, every corner, every hiding place where she could slip a secret and have it never found again. Beneath the floorboards by the hearth lay a small wooden box wrapped in cloth. Inside were things that no one else would find meaning in: a dried sprig of sage, a shard of mirror, a tiny vial of salt, and a button from a blue dress long burned in the master's trash heap. Things that tethered her to what little was left of her mother's world, and to the memory of the child she'd once had and lost. Sometimes, late at night, she could still hear him, the soft laugh, the little feet padding across the dirt floor of the quarters. She would turn toward the sound, half expecting to see him again, and always find only the flicker of firelight dancing on the walls. That was when her resolve hardened. The Beauregards had taken everything: body, blood, name, child, and expected gratitude in return. But they had made a mistake. They had left her hands free. Hands that could create beauty. Hands that could feed joy. Hands that could end it. So when the master announced his wedding, a ripple of celebration spread across Rosewater. The fields were to be trimmed, the quarters whitewashed, the brass polished until it caught the sun. Guests would travel from Baton Rouge and New Orleans, bringing laughter, champagne, and the smell of lilies. But down in the kitchen, Martha listened in and smiled. A small, bitter smile that no one saw, because the wedding meant preparation, and preparation meant opportunity. By the time the first guest arrived, the plantation would gleam like gold. But under that gold would run a quiet current, invisible, patient, deadly, waiting for the right moment to rise. And Martha, with her quiet eyes and steady hands, was the one who would set it free. The first sign of change came with the thunder, not the kind that split trees or shook windows, but the deep, slow roll that lingered far away, a sound that carried warning rather than rain. In Louisiana, thunder was an omen. The old ones whispered that it meant the spirits were turning over in their graves, restless, remembering. It was 2 weeks before the wedding when the sky began to change, and with it the rhythm of Rosewater. The house was suddenly alive with motion. Seamstresses came and went in carriages, bringing bolts of silk the color of pearl. Servants scrubbed the veranda until their hands bled, and field hands were called to cut flowers instead of cane. The master barked orders, the mistress scolded, and everywhere, there was laughter that didn't reach the eyes. The bride, Miss Lila Mae Dupree, arrived 3 days early from New Orleans, her voice sweet and sharp as citrus. She was no more than 19, with skin pale as moonlight and hair coiled like spun gold. She walked the halls of Rosewater as though she were already its queen, her perfume clinging to every doorway like honey left in the sun. And from the first moment she stepped into the kitchen, she made certain that Martha knew her place. "You there," she'd said without even asking a name. "You're the one who'll make my cake, aren't you? They say you can make anything taste like heaven." Martha kept her head bowed, her voice low. "Yes, ma'am." Lila's smile never reached her eyes. "Then make me something worth sinning for." The words hung in the air, sweet and cruel. Behind her, the master laughed. That same slow, knowing laugh that used to make Martha's stomach twist. "She'll do it," he said. "Our Martha's got the Lord's patience and the devil's touch." Martha didn't answer. She only turned back to her work, her knife slicing through butter with quiet precision, while inside her chest, something old and buried began to stir. That night, the storm broke. Rain fell heavy on the roof, drumming against the boards like the heartbeat of something ancient. Martha stayed behind after the others were sent to their quarters. She had been told to prepare sweet cream for the morning, and the firelight threw her shadow across the wall. Long and trembling, she was still stirring when she heard the footsteps. Charles Beauregard entered the kitchen with the slow arrogance of a man who believed the world owed him silence. His boots were slick with rain, his breath heavy with whiskey. He closed the door behind him and the room seemed to shrink. "Martha," he said, his voice soft, the kind of softness that came before cruelty. "You've been here, what, 10 years now? Maybe more." "Yes, master." He nodded, stepping closer, his eyes dragging over her like the edge of a knife. "You've done good work. My father used to say a house runs on 2 things, fear and food. You keep both in good supply." She didn't look at him. She knew better. She kept her eyes on the bowl, white cream swirling, reflecting the fire. "Tomorrow," he continued, "the bride's family comes from Baton Rouge. Important people. You'll make me proud, won't you?" "Yes, master." He came closer still, the smell of bourbon thick in the air. "Good, because I remember another time you didn't." Martha froze. The spoon slipped from her fingers, clattering into the bowl. He smiled, slow and cruel. "You remember the child, don't you? The little one who used to run to the kitchen door." Her chest tightened. She could feel her pulse in her throat. "He was a curious boy," Charles went on, swirling his drink. "Always wandering. Fell into the river, they said. Shame." The words came lazy, practiced. But there was something in his tone, a small, deliberate cruelty, that made Martha's blood turn cold. She had never known for certain how her son had died. She had only found his small wooden toy floating near the reeds, and the master's silence afterward. And now she knew. Charles took another sip, his eyes never leaving her. "So you'll make that cake perfect, Martha. For me, for my bride. You owe me that much." He left her there, shaking, hollow, as the rain hissed against the windows. When the door shut, Martha sank to her knees, the bowl tipping over, cream spilling across the floor like blood. Her hands trembled, and for the first time in years she let herself cry. Not in grief, but in clarity. She could see it now. Every humiliation, every lash of the tongue, every life stolen and forgotten. The ghosts of Rosewater had been whispering all along, and she had been too weary to listen. But now she heard them clearly, a chorus of voices beneath the thunder. Make it right. The next morning she worked as if nothing had changed. Her face was calm, her tone obedient. She served breakfast, polished silver, folded linens. But behind her eyes burned something new, something dangerous. A quiet current of intent that no one noticed, because no one looked closely at Martha. She began to collect things. Not all at once, that would have been foolish. A little at a time. A broken bottle from the trash heap behind the stables. A handful of coarse salt from the storeroom. A strip of muslin to bind her palm when she'd cut herself, or when she needed to hide something sharper. To the others, she was simply preparing for the wedding. But each night when the kitchen was empty, she knelt by the hearth and whispered to the box beneath the floorboards. "Soon," she murmured. "Soon they'll all taste what they've given." The air grew heavier with each passing day. Guests arrived, filling the house with perfume and laughter. The bride practiced her vows beneath the oak tree, her voice floating like a hymn. The master walked among his guests, his hand on her waist, his smile polished like the silver on his table. And Martha watched. She watched from the shadows of the kitchen doorway, hands folded, expression unreadable. She served their food, refilled their glasses, and all the while she waited for one final insult, one final spark to set the flame. It came the night before the wedding. Lila May, flushed from wine and giddy with pride, stumbled into the kitchen with her bridesmaids. She leaned on the counter where Martha worked and smirked at the old woman. "Tomorrow," she said, "I'll be the new mistress of Rosewater. You'll still be here, won't you? Cooking for me?" Martha kept her gaze down. "If that's what the Lord wills, ma'am." Lila giggled, eyes glittering. "Then make sure that cake is beautiful. The master says you have magic in those hands. But don't get any ideas. I wouldn't want your kind ruining my day." The girls laughed as they left, the sound echoing long after they were gone. Martha didn't move for a long time. Then she looked down at the bowl in front of her. at the sugar and flour and milk, and she smiled. For the first time in years, her hands stopped trembling. By the time dawn broke, Rosewater Plantation was wrapped in mist, and Martha, quiet, steady Martha, was ready to begin. The morning of the wedding broke heavy and pale, as if the sun itself didn't want to rise over Rosewater Plantation. Mist hung low across the cane fields, swallowing sound and color. The sky was bruised with the memory of last night's rain, and the air smelled faintly of lightning, that metallic scent that always came before something terrible. In the kitchen, the fire had already been lit. The flames moved quietly, steady and patient, as though they too were keeping a secret. Martha stood before the long wooden table, her apron already dusted with flour. Her motions were calm, mechanical, the measured rhythm of a woman who had spent her life preparing meals for those who never said thank you. But beneath that rhythm, something else pulsed. A plan, sharp and deliberate as the shards she'd hidden away. The other kitchen hands worked around her in hushed obedience. Mary, the younger one, was rolling dough. Samuel was hauling in fresh water. They stole glances at Martha now and then, noticing the strange stillness in her eyes, that eerie calm that came before a storm. None of them spoke of it. They knew enough about Martha to leave her to her silence. At her feet sat a small basket wrapped in linen. Inside, hidden beneath layers of sugar, were the fragments of glass she'd collected over the last week. Clear, delicate pieces from a broken bottle she'd ground down herself in the dead of night. Each one had been cleaned, dried, and sharpened by her own hands. They glimmered faintly whenever the firelight touched them, like ice under moonlight. When the door opened behind her, Martha did not turn. It was the overseer, Mr. Tate, a man who smiled only when something suffered. He stepped inside, mud still clinging to his boots, and surveyed the kitchen with a lazy authority. "Master says the cake better be on that table by sundown," he drawled. "Ain't no room for mistakes today, Martha." "Yes, sir," she said softly. He moved closer, tapping the side of her arm with his riding crop. Not hard, but enough to remind her what power felt like in this house. "I hear that bride's family's bringing city folk. Rich ones, you best mind your hands. Wouldn't want 'em shaking now." She didn't look up. "No, sir." Tate lingered for a moment longer, studying her face for any trace of emotion. When he found none, he chuckled and left, his boots trailing wet footprints across the floorboards. The door closed, and with it the mask dropped. Martha's hands clenched the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. Her mind was steady, but her heart beat fast. Not with fear, but focus. The plan had begun. She started with the batter, eggs cracked with quiet precision. Butter melted into cream. Sugar sifted through her fingers like fine sand. Her movements were graceful, ritualistic, almost sacred. Every motion carried weight, as though she were performing a ceremony known only to her and to whatever spirits might be watching from the shadows. From the corner of the room, the fire whispered, the flames flickering higher whenever she reached for the glass. She'd placed the fragments in a small mortar, wrapped in cloth, and crushed them further until they sparkled like grains of salt. With each strike of the pestle, she whispered under her breath, old words her mother had once taught her in a voice like smoke and honey. Let them taste their own ruin. Let sweetness turn to sorrow. She mixed the glass into the batter slowly, careful not to let the sound carry. The shards disappeared beneath layers of sugar and flour, invisible to anyone but her. To the eye, it was a perfect cake, smooth, golden, and innocent. But beneath that polished surface hid a truth sharp enough to slice through sin itself. Hours passed. The house above was alive with chaos, music being rehearsed, tables set, voices shouting across the halls. Through the open window came the faint strains of a violin, delicate and eerie, like a funeral song pretending to be a waltz. Down in the kitchen, Martha's world remained separate, quiet, self-contained, moving to its own heartbeat. Mary came to her once, nervous and pale. "Miss Martha," she whispered, "you been acting strange. You all right?" Martha looked up slowly, her expression unreadable. "I'm just doing what I always done, child." "Cooking for the master," Mary hesitated. "You sure you talking to yourself last night?" A thin smile touched Martha's lips. "Sometimes I do. Helps me remember." "Remember what?" "The right way to make things end." Mary didn't ask again. She backed away, eyes wide, and didn't speak to her for the rest of the day. By mid-afternoon, the cake was ready, 5 tiers tall, covered in white icing so smooth it caught the light like porcelain. Tiny roses sculpted by hand lined the edges. To any guest, it was the image of perfection. But Martha knew what waited beneath that beauty. A trap dressed as sweetness, a weapon disguised as celebration. She stood back to look at it, and for a moment she felt nothing. No triumph, no fear, only an immense stillness, the kind that comes when a decision has been carved too deep to be undone. She cleaned her hands, covered the cake with a lace cloth, and carried it into the dining hall. The hall was a cathedral of excess. White candles burned in gold holders. Crystal goblets gleamed. Outside, the magnolias were in full bloom, their scent heavy and intoxicating. Guests in pastel silks and powdered wigs filled the room with the hum of polite conversation. Charles Beauregard, dressed in cream and arrogance, stood near the head of the table, smiling for every handshake. The bride hovered at his side, her fingers tracing the pearl choker around her neck like a charm. When Martha entered, the music faltered. All eyes turned, but only for a moment. She was the help, invisible by design. Still, something in the way she moved, slow, deliberate, unflinching, made the room fall quiet for half a breath. She placed the cake on the long table with a bow of her head. "All done, master." Charles looked at her with a faint smirk. "Looks fine enough for a queen." Lila May clapped her hands. "It's beautiful." "Oh, Charles, look at it. She even made sugar flowers." Martha smiled faintly. "Every petal's made by hand, ma'am. Won't taste like any other you've had." "Well," the bride said, laughing lightly, "I should hope not." No one noticed how Martha's eyes lingered for a second longer than they should have. No one saw the way her fingers brushed the edge of the table, leaving a faint print of flour, a mark small and silent, like a signature. When the guests were seated and the first glasses of champagne poured, Martha slipped away to the back corridor. She moved through the servants' passage, her steps soundless. The house felt different now, too bright, too loud. Every note of music seemed to echo through her bones. From the open window she could see the river glinting in the distance, the same river that had swallowed her son, the same river that had carried away the last piece of her heart. She closed her eyes and whispered his name once, a breath more than a word. Then she turned back toward the hall. Evening descended slow and golden. Lanterns flickered. The guests laughed louder. Somewhere upstairs the bride's veil lay waiting. Soon they would cut the cake, the final act of celebration before vows, before the feast, before the world tilted. And Martha waited. She moved like a shadow between the walls. Her presence barely noticed, though she saw everything. The glint of the master's cufflinks, the sweat on his temple, the way he leaned close to Lila and whispered something that made her blush and glance toward the cake. He would make the first slice. He always did. He would boast. He would laugh. He would eat first. That was the way of men like him, always tasting before anyone else, confident the world could not harm them. Martha returned to the kitchen one last time. She sat by the fire, her hands folded, her face calm. The other servants murmured and worked around her, unaware of what was about to happen. The clock struck 6. The wedding music shifted from soft to jubilant. Outside, thunder rolled again, distant, low, like the earth remembering. Martha looked toward the door and whispered almost gently, "Now." The dining room erupted in applause as Charles Beauregard raised the knife. And in the kitchen below, Martha stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening. The next sound she heard would not be thunder. The clock in the Rosewater dining hall struck 6:30, its chime ringing through the house like a warning that no one heard. Candles flickered in long rows down the center of the table, their flames trembling with the restless hum of laughter and string music. Outside, cicadas sang their shrill song against the slow crawl of dusk. The air was thick with the scent of sugar, wine, and magnolia, too sweet, too heavy. The kind of sweetness that comes right before something rots. At the head of the table stood Charles Beauregard, a man drunk on his own celebration. His waistcoat strained slightly against his stomach, his cheeks red from champagne and pride. Beside him, Lila May Dupree, radiant and trembling with the giddy vanity of a girl who believed she had won the world. Between them sat the cake, 5 tiers of white perfection, glimmering in the candlelight. It was the kind of beauty that seemed impossible in this world. Flawless, pure, unblemished. The guests marveled, whispering admiration. They spoke of Martha's skill, of her gift, of how a woman with nothing could create something so divine. They didn't know that the devil had guided her hands. "Now then," Charles roared, raising his glass, "to the future of Rosewater, to my bride, To the blood and sweat that built this land. The guests cheered. Crystal clinked. Laughter filled the room. Then he set down his glass and turned toward the cake, reaching for the silver knife beside it. Martha, watching from the corridor through the half-open door, didn't move. She stood in the shadows, her eyes fixed on his hands. The same hands that had once held a whip, that had signed bills of sale, that had silenced her child's laughter forever. The knife's blade gleamed. Charles cut deep into the first tier, the sound of it soft but unmistakable, the delicate crunch of sugar and sponge. He lifted the first slice, perfectly white, and placed it on a porcelain plate edged with gold. Leela clapped, beaming. "Now, my love," he said, grinning. "A taste of forever." He fed her the first bite. She laughed, dainty and flushed, the cake dissolving on her tongue. Then she took the knife, cut a second piece, and offered it to him. Their guests applauded again, voices blurring into one warm, drunken chorus. Charles raised the fork, still smiling, and took the bite. The moment stretched, silent, suspended, like the air before lightning strikes. The first sound was small, a faint crunch. Then another. Lila's smile faltered. "Charles?" He froze mid-chew. The laughter around the table faded to a curious murmur. Charles frowned, his hand going to his mouth. "Something," he managed before blood bloomed between his teeth. The room went still. He coughed once, hard. Sharp sound, wet, ugly. Then again. A splatter of red streaked the pristine tablecloth. The guests recoiled with gasps. Lila screamed, "Charles!" He tried to speak, but his words came out as a strangled gurgle. His tongue had been cut by something sharp. He choked, clawing at his throat, eyes wild. A thin line of crimson trailed down his chin as he staggered backward, knocking over a glass of wine, the red liquid mingling with the darker stain of blood spreading across the table. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then chaos erupted. The guests shouted, chairs scraping against the floor. Someone called for the overseer, another for a doctor. Leela dropped to her knees beside him, sobbing. "What's happening? What's happening?" Charles convulsed, retching, blood spilling from his mouth in thick, jagged threads. His eyes rolled white. The fragments of glass, small, perfect, merciless, tore through him with every breath, every desperate gasp. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled, and he collapsed against the base of the table. The room stank of wine, sweat, and panic. Above it all, the cake sat untouched, beautiful, gleaming, innocent, a holy thing wearing sin's disguise. And in the corridor, Martha watched. She did not smile. She did not weep. She only stepped closer, her shadow falling long across the floorboards. Her hands were steady, folded neatly in front of her apron. Around her, the house thundered with noise, screams, footsteps, frantic prayers. But her world was quiet, suspended in perfect stillness. For the first time in years, she felt the air fill her lungs without weight. Lila May's sobs echoed through the hall. "Help him! Somebody help him!" The overseer pushed through the crowd, grabbing Martha's arm as she entered. "You," he barked. "What did you do? What did you put in that cake?" Martha met his eyes. "Exactly what he asked for," she said softly. "Something worth sinning for." Tate raised his hand to strike her, but before he could, another voice broke through the chaos, shrill and terrified. "It's in the cake. There's glass in the cake." The words rippled through the guests like fire through dry cane. Lila's face went pale. She turned toward the cake, trembling, and saw it at last. Faint glints catching in the candlelight, tiny fragments gleaming between the white crumbs. She shrieked and stumbled backward, her dress streaked with blood and frosting. The overseer grabbed Martha again, but she didn't resist. She stood still, her voice low, almost reverent. "You built your house on our bones," she whispered. "Now taste what your hands have made." Charles Beauregard gasped once more, a final ragged breath that rattled in his throat, then went still. His head slumped to the side, eyes open, glassy and wide. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the rug, the color of ruined wine. Silence fell, thick, suffocating, eternal. Outside, the thunder returned. It rolled across the fields, shaking the windows, rattling the chandelier. Some of the guests crossed themselves. Others ran for the door, their silk shoes slipping on the blood-slick floor. Servants screamed and scattered. Leela May fainted, her white gown collapsing beside her husband's body like a broken lily. And through it all, Martha stood in the center of the storm, unmoving. Her gaze drifted upward, to the portraits of the Beauregard ancestors that lined the walls. those solemn faces that had watched over every cruelty, every whip, every sale. Their eyes seemed to flicker in the candlelight, as if finally bearing witness to their own undoing. When the overseer finally spoke, his voice trembled. "You'll hang for this," he spat. "You know that?" Martha turned her head toward him, her expression unreadable. "I've been hanging all my life, Mr. Tate. Just finally decided to stop swinging." She took one slow step forward, then another. He backed away. "Don't you move, woman." But she kept coming, eyes steady, voice calm. "You can kill me, but you can't stop what's already been done. Ain't no preacher can bless this house clean again." The air around them seemed to darken, the candle flames bending low as if bowing. Outside, the wind rose, howling through the cane fields. Somewhere in the distance, dogs began to bark. Tate lunged for her arm, but in the next moment, the chandelier above snapped from its chain. It crashed down between them in a burst of glass and fire, scattering shards across the floor. Screams filled the hall once more as guests fled in terror. Smoke rose, carrying the scent of sugar and burning wax. When it cleared, Martha was gone. No one saw her leave. Some said she slipped into the fields under cover of smoke. Others swore they saw her walk straight into the storm, her figure dissolving in the rain. By morning, the fires in the house had burned out. The master's body lay cold, the bride delirious, whispering that she could still taste glass between her teeth. The guests left before dawn, pale and shaken, leaving behind the wreckage of what had been meant as a wedding and ended as a curse. Only the kitchen remained untouched, the oven still warm, the table still dusted with flour, and on it, a single piece of untouched cake, white, flawless, glinting faintly in the light of dawn. In the silence that followed, the fields were still. The house groaned in the wind, and somewhere faintly came the sound of laughter, low, soft, and familiar, echoing from the direction of the river. By the time the sun rose over the Rosewater Plantation, the house no longer looked alive. Smoke hung above the roof like a mourning veil. The grand white columns were stained with soot, the lace curtains blackened where candle flames had licked them during the chaos. The great hall, once polished to a mirror sheen, was now a ruin of overturned chairs, shattered glass, and blood that had seeped deep into the wooden floorboards. Dark, sticky, impossible to scrub clean. The guests had vanished before dawn, their carriages rattling down the muddy road, wheels cutting through the silence like fleeing confessions. They left behind their silk fans, their gloves, their empty champagne glasses, tokens of a night they would never speak of again. Inside the house, Lillemay Dupree Beauregard sat in what was left of her wedding gown, her eyes vacant. Her golden hair was tangled and damp, her hands trembling in her lap. She hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. Every time she blinked, she could still see it. The flicker of glass beneath the frosting, the red bloom in her husband's mouth, the sound of his choking as the guests screamed. She whispered sometimes, to no one in particular, "I can still taste it. It's still in me." The servants avoided her. Some believed she'd gone mad. Others said she was cursed, that when she closed her eyes, she saw Martha's face in the dark behind them, silent and waiting. The overseer, Tate, had gathered a few men to search the grounds at first light. They found nothing. No footprints, no torn fabric, no sign of struggle. Only the soft mud of the cane fields and the still water of the river reflecting a gray, heavy sky. "She's gone," one man muttered. "Ain't no trace," Tate spat into the dirt. "Nobody just disappears, not her. Not after that." But deep down, even he didn't believe his own words. The rest of the slaves kept their eyes low, their mouths shut. They moved through the day in silence, as though afraid to wake something that still lingered in the air. The kitchen was sealed off. No one dared step inside. Rumors spread quickly, that the fire in Martha's oven had never gone out, that the ashes still glowed red even after buckets of water were thrown on them. By the second night, the overseer posted guards at the edge of the property. But when dawn came, one of them was gone. They found his lantern near the riverbank, still burning. His boots, empty, stood upright in the mud. The rest refused to stand watch after that. Days turned to weeks. The wedding feast rotted where it had been left. Flies gathered on the remains of the cake, their buzzing filling the hollow rooms like a chorus of whispered prayers. Lila May stopped speaking entirely. She took to her bed, pale and silent, refusing food. Her lips cracked and red. Once the maid swore she heard her whisper in her sleep, "She's in the walls." She's watching. The fields went untended. Workers left under cover of night, disappearing into the swamps. Those who stayed said that sometimes, in the deep hours before dawn, they could smell sugar in the air, thick and cloying, drifting from the kitchen long after the ovens had gone cold, and sometimes they heard humming. A woman's voice, low and steady, carrying an old tune no one remembered the words to. By the end of the season, Rosewater was finished. The crops withered, the house decayed. Charles Beauregard's kin came from Baton Rouge to claim the property, but none would stay the night. The walls seemed to breathe, they said. The floors creaked with footsteps when no one walked. The mirrors fogged without heat, as though someone unseen stood just behind the glass. One of the men, a lawyer, bold and skeptical, insisted on eating a piece of the leftover cake, half to prove a point. He chewed once, twice, then dropped his fork, eyes wide. Blood welled in his mouth, though there was no glass this time. He swore he'd felt it, sharpness slicing from the inside out. He left before dark and never came back. As for Martha, no one ever saw her again. But the stories began almost immediately. Field hands said they'd seen her walking along the riverbank on moonless nights, her apron clean, her hands folded. Others claimed her reflection appeared in the kitchen window whenever someone lied. Children whispered that if you left a bowl of sugar uncovered overnight, by morning it would glisten with something sharp. And sometimes, when the wind blew from the east, the air carried the faintest trace of almond and ash, the scent of Martha's final creation, lingering like a warning. Years passed. The Beauregard name faded. The house collapsed in on itself, reclaimed by vines and moss. But the land remained, still silent and heavy with memory. Travelers who camped near the ruins told strange tales, that the ground around the old kitchen never cooled, that the soil there glittered faintly in moonlight. A few swore they heard a voice in the wind whispering a single word, taste, and then nothing. Rosewater Plantation was never rebuilt. The land was left to rot, swallowed by swamp and silence. But those who know the story say the place still stands in spirit, waiting, patient as the woman who once stood before her oven and planned her vengeance in flour and fire. And on certain nights, when the heat sits thick over the cane fields and thunder rolls without rain, locals say you can still smell cake baking, sweet at first, then bitter, then gone. Years turned to decades, and the Rosewater Plantation was claimed by the earth. The cane fields grew wild, choking the crumbled remains of fences and gates. Spanish moss hung thick from the trees, draping the old drive like a funeral shroud. The house itself became little more than bones, a skeleton of brick and timber, its windows hollow, its staircases leading nowhere. When the river rose, it crept into the foundations, washing through the parlor where laughter and screams had once mingled. Nature swallowed what was left, but some things refused to die. In the small towns along the river road, St. Francisville, Plaquemine, Port Hudson, folks still spoke of the wedding night curse. Mothers told it to their daughters when teaching them to bake. Never mock the hands that make your bread, and never tempt a heart that has known too much silence. Old men by the docks would nod toward the thick line of cypress and say, "That's where Rosewater stood. You go in there after dark, you'll smell sugar before you see her." And always, always, they said her. Not it, not the ghost, but Martha. The stories changed with every generation. Some said she still roamed the ruins in her flour-dusted apron, humming her work songs, searching for her child's laughter. Others whispered she became something less human, a spirit bound to the house itself, her soul baked into the walls. On humid nights when thunder crawled low over the horizon, the kitchen would light from within, though no fire burned. A faint glow, the smell of almonds, the crackle of something unseen. A few said she wasn't haunting the place at all. She was protecting it, guarding the land from any who might rebuild and repeat the sins buried beneath its soil. And so no one ever did. One year, a traveling preacher came through the parish determined to cleanse the ground. He brought with him scripture, holy water, and a crowd of the faithful. They stood before the ruins at dawn and prayed until their throats went dry. When the sun rose high, he sprinkled the ashes with blessed water and declared the curse broken. That night, the preacher's tent caught fire. No one heard him scream. By morning, nothing was left but the smell, sweet like burning sugar. After that, no one tried again. Sometimes strange travelers would stop in the nearest town and ask about the story. They'd heard rumors of a woman wronged, of a wedding turned to horror, of vengeance served in a slice of cake. The locals would give them the same answer. Always slow, always careful. She wasn't evil. She was forgotten. That's worse. They would tell how Martha was born a slave, died a myth, and became something eternal. A warning carved not in stone, but in silence. They'd speak her name softly, not out of fear, but respect. Because in their bones they understood. Her story was not just about murder or revenge. It was about what happens when pain has no voice, when justice has no place to rest. And somewhere, deep in the ruins, her name would stir in the dust, like a breath drawn in. It is said that once every few years, on a night when lightning flashes without rain, the air around the river turns unnaturally still. The crickets hush, the frogs fall silent, and in that pause, if you stand near the edge of the cane field and listen, you'll hear it, the sound of a knife sliding through cake. A slow, deliberate slice, then a hum, soft, low, sorrowful. A woman's voice keeping time with her own heartbeat. If you follow it, some say you'll see her. Not as she was, but as she's become. A shadow in white, her hands dusted with flour, her face lit by an unseen fire. She will look at you, not with hatred, but with memory. A warning, a promise, and something close to peace. But if you're foolish enough to speak her name aloud, to ask her what she's baking, she'll turn her gaze toward you and whisper, for the ones who never learn to chew slow. Then the wind rises, the sugar smell vanishes, and you find yourself alone again, standing where the Rosewater kitchen once stood. The legend of Martha Beauregard, the slave who fed her master his own sins, endures in whispers and campfire tales. Historians say it's only folklore, a plantation myth born from guilt and superstition. But those who've walked that river road at night know better, because when the moon is high and the air is thick, you can still taste sweetness on your tongue. Sweet, sharp, and wrong, like sugar hiding a secret, like glass waiting in the dark. And long after you've left the ruins behind, you'll find yourself glancing back just once, because something inside you swears you can still hear her humming. The cake was never meant for one man, the locals say. It was meant for all of them. And they are right, because in Louisiana, when the night air smells faintly of sugar and storm, they say Martha is still baking, still waiting, still watching,